The firing range at Fort Bragg was never truly silent. Even after the last soldier left, echoes seemed to linger in the dry Carolina night air. Spent brass glimmered faintly under the pale floodlights, and the faint scent of burnt gunpowder clung stubbornly to the concrete floor. Most nights, the range shut down by 8, and the barracks hummed with laughter, poker games, or the dull rhythm of boots stomping in drill practice. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't in the barracks. She was here, in the dark, her hands moving across the cool steel frame of the Barrett .50, as if it were a living thing. She sat cross-legged on the ground, the rifle stretched out in front of her like a great beast sleeping. To most, the Barrett was unwieldy, too heavy, too loud, too brutal for finesse. But Sarah didn't see it that way. She treated the rifle as though it had a soul, each bolt and screw polished, each joint understood. Her hands worked slowly, carefully, checking the scope mounts, adjusting the bipod legs, running her cloth across the barrel again and again until it gleamed faintly under the lamp. From the outside, it looked like obsession-mindless polishing, unnecessary tinkering. A few passing soldiers had laughed about it earlier that week. Mitchell's dating her rifle, one of them had joked, chuckling with his buddies. Sarah heard them, but she didn't respond. She never did. What they didn't know was that every cloth stroke, every click of a knob was deliberate. She wasn't just cleaning the weapon. She was memorizing it, syncing her own body with its rhythm, learning its quirks the way a pianist learns the keys. Her notebook lay open beside her. The pages were filled not with words, but with numbers, formulas, and tiny sketches. Wind speed tables, bullet drop charts, humidity corrections calculations. That looked like gibberish to anyone else. She flipped to a fresh page, wrote down the temperature for the night, checked the wind with a tiny handheld anemometer, and logged the data. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, like a surgeon recording vital signs. At first, Sarah had started, staying late out of necessity. During regular hours, the range was crowded, noisy, filled with banter and the staccato rhythm of short bursts. No one took the time to appreciate the silence between shots, the breath, the stillness before the trigger broke. But at night, when the others were gone, she could hear her own breathing. She could feel the pulse in her fingertips. She could practice the art of patience without distraction. And patience was what the Barrett demanded. The rifle weighed 30 pounds fully loaded, its recoil strong enough to bruise shoulders. Most soldiers fired it only a handful of times before passing it off, treating it as little more than a powerful anti-material weapon, something for vehicles and equipment, not precision work. But Sarah had seen its potential. The Barrett wasn't just brute force. In the right hands, with the right skill, it could reach farther than any sniper rifle in history. That thought haunted her every night. How far could she push it? She settled into prone position, the massive rifle stretched out ahead. She adjusted the bipod legs, pressed her cheek against the stock, and looked through the scope. Tonight, the target wasn't a steel plate, but a small red dot she had painted on a broken cinder block nearly 1,800 meters away. Under the moonlight, it was barely visible, a speck against the desert-colored rubble. Her breathing slowed. In, out, out. She held at the bottom of her breath, finger resting lightly on the trigger. She squeezed. The Barrett roared like thunder. Dust rose from the ground. Echo rolled across the night. Sarah didn't flinch. She kept her eye on the scope, watching. 2 seconds later, a faint spark burst off the cinder block. She allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Another hit logged. She opened her notebook, wrote down the shot, adjusted her data for the crosswind. She would fire again and again and again until the numbers matched reality. Hours passed like that. Most nights, she lost track of time until the sky in the O East began to glow faintly blue. Her hands grew calloused, her elbows bruised from the concrete, her body stiff from lying prone for hours. But she didn't complain. This was her sanctuary. She remembered something her father once told her before she joined the army. Most people think greatness is loud, but real greatness? It's quiet. It's the work no one sees. At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, with the smell of cordite in her nose and the echo of her own gunshots in the air, she finally did. By the third month, Sarah had become a ghost of the barracks. She skipped card games, missed late-night dinners, avoided weekend trips. Some thought she was antisocial. Others thought she was strange. A few whispered rumors maybe she was breaking down. Maybe she was obsessed. She ignored it all. The Barrett was more than a weapon to her now. It was a puzzle, a challenge, a truth waiting to be unlocked. She began experimenting with distances most wouldn't even attempt. 2,000 meters. 2,500. She built makeshift targets out of old metal sheets and lugged them herself across the scrubland, marking each with red spray paint. She calculated bullet flight times, sometimes waiting 4-5 seconds after pulling the trigger before hearing the faint ping of impact. Each successful shot was like a conversation with the impossible. Some nights she failed. The wind shifted, the bullet dropped short, or the mirage of heat waves bent her line of sight. She would curse under her breath, tear out the page of her notes, and start again. But failure didn't discourage her, it fueled her. Every miss meant there was more to learn, more data to refine, more patience to cultivate. On one particularly cold night, her fingers numb, she missed 3 shots in a row at 2,800 meters. Frustration boiled in her chest. She slammed the rifle shut, rolled onto her back, and stared up at the sky. The stars were sharp, endless, cold. She closed her eyes, remembering her father's voice again. Quiet work, Sarah. Quiet work. She exhaled, rolled back over, and tried again. This time, she hit. The sound echoed faintly in the night air, like a bell tolling for her persistence. By now, even the night security guards had grown used to her presence. A sergeant on patrol once stopped and asked, half joking, "Mitchell, you trying to marry that rifle?" She looked up from her notes and simply replied, "I'm learning its language." The sergeant didn't know what to say, so he left her to it. What Sarah didn't realize was that her work was beginning to draw quiet attention. A few junior officers had noticed her range times. Someone in logistics mentioned how much .50 caliber ammo was disappearing into the night. Rumors drifted up the chain of command, but no one took it seriously yet. After all, what was she really doing? Just polishing a rifle. Just firing a few rounds. Nothing special. At least, that's what they thought. What none of them saw was the transformation taking place. Each night, each shot, each entry in her notebook was building towards something beyond their imagination. Sarah wasn't just training. She was sharpening herself into a weapon as precise and relentless as the Barrett itself. And when the day came to test her, to prove herself before doubters and generals alike, she would not simply shoot. She would make history. General David Thompson had spent 35 years in uniform. He had served in sandstorms that choked lungs and jungles so wet they drowned radios, commanded battalions in wars most civilians had long forgotten, and sat across polished oak tables with leaders who made decisions that shaped entire regions. He was a soldier disciplined, sharp, and impossible to impress. He was also a man who believed he had seen it all. When the Army assigned him temporary oversight of training operations at Fort Bragg, Thompson didn't expect surprises. The base ran on routine drills, qualifications, logistics, reports. Soldiers came and went, most indistinguishable from one another. In his experience, talent announced itself loudly. He could spot a rising star within 5 minutes. The swagger, the confidence, the voice that carried authority before rank even granted it. Those were the soldiers he watched. The rest faded into the blur of green and brown. And then there was Captain Sarah Mitchell. The first time Thompson noticed her was almost by accident. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low over the pines, the range still echoing with gunfire as soldiers finished their qualifications. Thompson had been walking the perimeter with a young aide, reviewing performance reports, when his gaze drifted to one of the far lanes. There she was, flat on her stomach, Barrett .50 stretched out in front of her, cleaning rag beside her boot. At first, he thought nothing of it. Soldiers cleaned their weapons all the time. But something about the picture froze him for a moment. She wasn't just wiping the rifle down, she was studying it. Her eyes traced the scope like an architect studying blueprints. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as though every turn of a knob was connected to some calculation running silently. In her head, Thompson's aide noticed his pause. "That's Captain Mitchell, sir. Logistics officer, technically. Though she spends half her nights here on the range." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "On the Barrett?" "Yes, sir. Obsessed with it, from what I hear. Some of the guys joke she'll wear it out before she fires it." The general gave a short laugh. He had heard it before: young officers fixating on the wrong things, wasting time polishing gear instead of sharpening themselves. It was always the same. Eventually, reality set in. A Barrett wasn't a precision instrument like an M40 or M2010. It was a monster, designed to punch holes through vehicles and walls. Good for anti-material work, not for the delicate craft of long-range sniping. "She's wasting her time," Thompson said flatly, shaking his head. But something in the scene lingered with him. Over the next few weeks, he saw her again and again. Always on the range, always with the Barrett. Sometimes in daylight, more often when the floodlights flickered. To life and the other soldiers had already cleared out. Each time she looked the same, focused, calm, meticulous. He rarely saw her laugh or joke with the others. She wasn't chasing approval, wasn't trying to impress. She was simply working. Still, he remained unconvinced. Talent, in his eyes, had a rhythm. A soldier destined for greatness carried themselves with a visible energy, confidence in their stride, the kind that drew others like moths to flame. Sarah Mitchell? She blended into the background. Too quiet, too contained. If she had skill, she was burying it beneath layers of silence. And silence, in Thompson's world, didn't win wars. One evening, curiosity pulled him closer. He walked onto the range as she lay prone, sighting down the long barrel. He stood behind her, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his presence. She simply adjusted her cheek on the stock and fired. The Barrett's roar cracked the night. The recoil pushed against her shoulder. Dust kicked into the air. Through his binoculars, Thompson watched the target, an old steel plate a mile away. A faint spark jumped as the bullet struck. Dead center. He narrowed his eyes. Beginners. Luck, he thought. She adjusted, fired again. Another hit. Interesting, he muttered under his breath. His aide, standing nearby, leaned in. "Sir?" "Nothing," Thompson said quickly. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction. He had seen flukes before, soldiers stringing together a handful of good shots, only to collapse under real pressure. Shooting on a con range was one thing. Shooting in chaos was another. But still, he watched. Over the following days, Thompson found himself lingering near the range more often. He told himself it was routine oversight, just part of his duty. Yet every time, his eyes sought her lane first. He studied the way she recorded data in her notebook, how she spent as much time calculating as she did firing. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't showy. She was patient. It unnerved him. Patience was not common among young officers. Most rushed, eager to impress, eager to climb. She did the opposite. She disappeared into solitude, grinding in the shadows. And that, Thompson realized, was what unsettled him most. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She wasn't even trying to prove anyone wrong. She was simply pursuing something no one else understood. One afternoon, as he watched her adjust her scope for the 5th time before firing, Thompson muttered to himself, "What exactly are you chasing, Captain?" The question gnawed at him. In the officers' mess that evening, he brought her name up casually with another colonel. The man chuckled. "Mitchell? She's harmless, sir. Good logistics mind, but a little eccentric. Stays up all night scribbling numbers, polishing that 50 cal like it's her firstborn. The guys call her the rifle nun." The table laughed. Thompson forced a smile, but the comment sat uneasily with him. He had spent his life surrounded by men who underestimated quiet soldiers, only to be surprised when the quiet ones changed battles. He thought of a young sergeant he'd once dismissed in Iraq, until that sergeant had saved an entire convoy with a single daring maneuver. Doubt could blind even seasoned generals. That night, he couldn't sleep. He poured himself a glass of bourbon in his quarters and stared out the window at the faint glow of the range lights in the distance. Somewhere out there, Mitchell was probably still at it, aligning crosshairs with targets no one else bothered to set up. He shook his head. Obsession, he told himself. Nothing more. And yet, a voice deep inside whispered otherwise. He took another sip of bourbon, leaned back in his chair, and frowned. He prided himself on reading soldiers. But Sarah Mitchell was a riddle, one he couldn't solve. For the first time in years, General David Thompson felt something unfamiliar stirring. In his chest, not admiration, not yet, but curiosity. And curiosity, he knew, was dangerous. Because if Captain Mitchell wasn't wasting her time, if all those late nights, all those calculations, all that quiet dedication amounted to something real, then he might be staring at the kind of soldier who didn't just follow history. She could rewrite it. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly, a canvas of sand, rock, and heat that shimmered like glass under the midday sun. The army had chosen this place for its vast emptiness, for the way the horizon seemed to dissolve into nothing. It was perfect. For long-range testing, no obstacles, no distractions, only distance and silence. A row of steel targets stood like sentinels across the barren field. The closest was set at 1,000 meters, the farthest nearly 2 miles out. They glinted faintly under the sun, daring any soldier bold enough to reach for them. Dust devils twisted across the flats, and the faint smell of oil and gunpowder already hung in the air. For most soldiers, this test was routine. It was an opportunity to prove skill, to earn bragging rights, to show off in front of commanders. For Sarah Mitchell, it was something else entirely. She stood quietly at the edge of the assembly, her Barrett resting against her shoulder like an old companion. Around her, the others laughed and joked, swapping bets on who would last longest, who would land the farthest hit. The Barrett was a monster of a weapon. Most soldiers preferred lighter rifles, easier to carry and control. Sarah's choice drew a few chuckles. "She's bringing a tank buster to a precision test," one man whispered. His friend smirked. "Hell, she probably won't make it past 1,000 meters. That thing's not built for finesse." Sarah ignored them. She always did. Her focus wasn't on the men beside her, or the laughter behind her back. Her eyes were on the horizon, tracing the faint outlines of the targets she'd been dreaming about for months. General Thompson stood nearby, his arms folded across his chest, sunglasses reflecting the sun. He had positioned himself just behind the firing line, not too close, but close enough to observe. His reputation preceded him. Sharp, uncompromising, a man who judged quickly and rarely changed his mind. When he spotted Sarah, he felt that familiar tug of skepticism. There she was again, quiet, expression unreadable. Barrett cradled with the kind of reverence others reserved for heirlooms. He wondered if she had any idea what she was walking into. The range officer barked orders, and a line of shooters formed. Dust crunched under boots as soldiers dropped to the ground, checked their rifles, adjusted their scopes. The sound of bolts racking, magazines clicking into place, and bipods striking the dirt filled the air. Sarah knelt slowly, laying the Barrett down with deliberate care. She extended the bipod, tested its stability on the sand, and then eased herself into prone position. The weight of the rifle pressed into her shoulder, but it no longer felt cumbersome. To her, it felt like balance, like the meeting point between her body and the machine. The officer's whistle blew. The first volley erupted. Dozens of rifles thundered at once, bullets cutting invisible paths across the desert. The air trembled with the sound, echoing against the barren hills. Spotters shouted calls, radios crackled, and dust clouds rose where shots missed their marks. Sarah didn't fire. Not yet. Her breathing slowed, her body sinking deeper into the sand. She adjusted the scope, dialed her calculations, felt the wind against her cheek. She was waiting. For the stillness, waiting for the rifle to speak to her the way it always did in the quiet hours of night. General Thompson noticed. While the others fired quickly, eager to impress, she was motionless. Through his binoculars, he saw her chest rise and fall, saw her hands adjust the rifle with surgical precision. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't competing with anyone but herself. Finally, she squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared like thunder cracking across the desert. Its recoil jolted the sand, the sound so deep it seemed to vibrate in the chest of every man on the line. 2 seconds later, the steel target at 1,000 meters rang out, a sharp metallic clang that cut through the noise. The spotter shouted confirmation. Target hit. Sarah adjusted again, unhurried. Another shot. Another clang. Then another. The murmurs started almost immediately. Soldiers glanced sideways, their smirks faltering. Most had managed a hit or two, but her consistency was unnerving. Every shot rang true. By the time she cleared the 1,500-meter plate, silence had spread across the firing line. The laughter was gone. Only the Barrett's thunder remained. General Thompson lowered his binoculars, lips pressed in a thin line. He didn't want to admit it, but something about her calm unnerved him. This wasn't luck. This was practiced, refined skill. But still, he reminded himself, hitting at 1,500 meters wasn't the same as pushing the rifle to its limits. And yet, he couldn't look away. Sarah kept working, her movements fluid, mechanical. She logged the wind, adjusted the scope, fired again. She wasn't chasing applause. She wasn't performing for anyone. She was simply locked in a quiet rhythm with her weapon, as though the rest of the world didn't exist. Her notebook lay open beside her, numbers scribbled in the margins. To the soldiers who glanced at it, it looked like madness. To her, it was order. Every calculation, every correction, was part of the conversation between her and the impossible distance stretching before her. The officer called for the next distance, 2,000 meters. Several shooters shook their heads, lowering their rifles. Too far. Not worth the wasted rounds. Sarah didn't hesitate. She realigned the Barrett, adjusted her scope for elevation, compensated for the shimmering heat waves bending the horizon. Her breathing slowed again. In, out. The shot rang out. Seconds stretched thin, then clang. The spotter blinked. Target hit. A ripple of disbelief swept the line. General Thompson's jaw tightened. He raised his binoculars again, focusing on the distant plate. There it was, swaying faintly under the impact. No doubt, she had done it. She can't keep that up, he muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince his aide or himself. But Sarah wasn't thinking about keeping it up. She wasn't thinking about anyone else at all. Her world had narrowed to the rifle, the target, the breath between shots. Another round. Another hit. By now, the desert was silent, except for the echo of the Barrett. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The other soldiers had stopped firing, their rifles resting idle as they watched. Some crossed their arms, frowning. Others simply shook their heads, stunned. Sarah reloaded, adjusted, fired again. The Barrett spoke, and the desert answered. General Thompson exhaled slowly, lowering his binoculars once more. His doubts had not vanished, but they were cracking, piece by piece, like stone under relentless pressure. He had dismissed her as eccentric, obsessive, wasting time. But what he was witnessing didn't look like waste. It looked like mastery. Still, he wasn't ready to admit it. He turned to his aide, his voice low. "Let's see how far she can really go." The aide nodded, eyes wide with disbelief. As Sarah prepared for the next distance, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. The test was no longer about routine qualification. It had become something else entirely. For Sarah, it was the culmination of every silent night on the range, every calculation, every missed shot that had taught her patience. For General Thompson, it was the beginning of an uncomfortable realization that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in silence, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as the Barrett roared again, echoing across the endless Nevada sands, he began to suspect that Captain Sarah Mitchell's moment had just begun. The desert sun was sinking, bleeding orange across the Nevada sky as the long-range test moved into its second stage. The air shimmered with heat waves that bent the horizon like liquid glass. Dust clung to skin and lips, rifles grew hot to the touch, and sweat dripped steadily into the sand. Yet no one moved from the firing line. This was where reputations were made. The first wave of shooters had taken their positions. Their rifles cracked one after another, echoing in a steady rhythm across the flat land. Spotters barked out confirmations, the metallic clang of steel occasionally cutting through the noise when someone managed to hit. Most shots, though, were wide. The heat, the crosswind, the sheer distance each made the desert merciless. The men treated it like sport. They joked between shots, jeered when someone missed, slapped each other on the back for near hits. One corporal even blew a kiss to the spotter after finally landing around on the 1,200-meter plate. The line erupted in laughter. It was bravado. The kind soldiers wore like armor, confidence in the face of failure. But Sarah Mitchell was not laughing. She lay prone at the far end of the line, the Barrett .50 stretched before her like a beast at rest, her cheek pressed against the stock, her hands calm, her breathing slow. She wasn't part of their noise. She wasn't part of their game. The chatter around her faded into nothing, as if she were sealed in glass. Her world had narrowed to one thing, the target. General Thompson watched from behind the line, binoculars raised. He had been unimpressed with most of the shooters, too sloppy, too eager, too loud. This was familiar to him. Ordinary soldiers, ordinary skills. But when his gaze slid to the quiet figure at the end, something in his chest tightened. She still hadn't fired. While others squeezed off round after round, Sarah was still adjusting. She calculated elevation, wind, and humidity with the precision of a surgeon. Her notebook lay beside her, pages filled with scribbles. She checked it once, twice, then set her pen aside. Finally, she inhaled. The Barrett thundered. The recoil slammed back, shaking the ground. Thompson's binoculars snapped to the target. For 2 long seconds, nothing. Then clang. The 1,500-meter plate shivered, a faint spark of light jumping from the steel. Target hit. The spotter shouted. The laughter along the line stuttered. Heads turned. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't look at the others, didn't react. She simply adjusted her scope, shifted her weight, and fired again. Another thunderclap. Another long silence. Another clang. Target hit. Whispers spread across the shooters. The corporal, who had been clowning earlier, frowned, his rifle forgotten. "No way," he muttered. The third shot came. Clang. The fourth. Clang. Now the line was silent. The Barrett roared again and again, and every time the desert answered. Each metallic strike carried further than any voice, echoing across the scrubland, undeniable. It was no longer sport. It was something else, something colder, heavier, real. General Thompson lowered his binoculars, lips pressed thin. He wanted to call it luck, a streak, a coincidence. But luck didn't repeat itself with mathematical precision. Luck didn't pause between shots to write calculations in a notebook before firing again. He exhaled slowly, feeling the first hairline. Cracks in his certainty. Sarah continued, her rhythm unbroken. She paused only to adjust her scope, her breathing as steady as if she were asleep. In, out, in, out. Then another shot, another hit. It was mechanical, relentless, a conversation between her and the rifle that no one else could hear. By the 7th hit, even the spotter sounded stunned. "Target hit," he said again, voice quieter now, almost reverent. The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Their earlier laughter had vanished, replaced with something heavier: resentment, awe, maybe even fear. Some of them had trained for years, yet here was Mitchell, quiet, withdrawn, dismantling every assumption they held about the Barrett and about her. One sergeant spat into the sand. "It's a trick. She can't keep that up." But she did. Shot after shot, the Barrett spoke, and the desert sang back. General Thompson couldn't tear his eyes away. He had dismissed her as eccentric, obsessed, wasting her time. But what he saw now didn't look like waste. It looked like inevitability, as if every late night, every calculation, every quiet hour alone on the range had led to this exact moment. He leaned slightly toward his aide. "Are you seeing this?" The aide nodded, wide-eyed. "Yes, sir," Thompson grunted. He hated being wrong. But what unsettled him most wasn't the possibility that she was good. It was the gnawing suspicion that she was greater than he had imagined. And greatness, he knew, came with consequences. On the line, Sarah exhaled, adjusted once more, and fired. The Barrett's roar echoed like thunder rolling over mountains. The target at 2,000 meters rang out, steel groaning under impact. The spotter shouted the confirmation. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah didn't notice the silence. She didn't notice the stares, the whispers, the shifting bodies along the line. Her mind was elsewhere, deep in the narrow tunnel of discipline she had built for herself. She was still in the quiet nights at Fort Bragg, lying under the floodlights, talking to the Barrett like it was the only thing in the world. Each shot now was a memory of those nights. Each hit was a conversation with her past self, the one who had missed, cursed, tried again, refused to quit. The desert wasn't new. The test wasn't new. She had already fought this battle 1,000 times in the dark when no one was watching. This was just the first time anyone else had seen it. By the end of the first round, Sarah had done what no one else on the line had accomplished. She had cleared distances others hadn't even attempted. Her notebook was filled with fresh calculations. Her rifle still gleamed with the care of someone who saw it as more than a weapon. General Thompson lowered his binoculars, his jaw tight, his mind unsettled. He had thought she was polishing a rifle to pass the time. Now, standing in the Nevada desert with the echo of her shots still ringing in his ears, he realized she was polishing herself. The doubt was still there, stubborn as stone. But for the first time in years, General Thompson felt something he hadn't expected: anticipation. Because if these were only her first shots, what came next might defy everything he thought he knew. The desert had gone quiet. Not the natural quiet of sand and wind, but a silence pressed down by awe, disbelief, and the weight of something extraordinary. Soldiers who had laughed an hour ago now stood with folded arms and tight jaws. Rifles lay forgotten at their sides. Every man on the line had stopped being a participant and had become an audience. At the center of it all lay Sarah Mitchell. The Barrett rested in the crook of her shoulder, the bipod dug into the sand, the great weapon gleaming under the fading desert sun. The steel plates she had been striking with flawless precision lay at distances others hadn't dared to attempt. The furthest hit so far, 2,000 meters, still rang faintly in the ears of everyone present. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her eyes had shifted farther, much farther, beyond the 2,500-meter target, beyond the last plate most spotters even tracked. She was staring at the speck of steel set at 3,200 meters, just under 2 miles away. A distance reserved for myths, not soldiers. Even General Thompson, who had spent decades overseeing training and operations, had never seen a man or woman hit a target at far with a Barrett. Not once. The rifle was built for power, not miracles. And yet, Sarah was preparing as if it were inevitable. She flipped open her notebook. Numbers filled the page. Wind drift charts, elevation corrections, humidity adjustments. Her pen scratched quickly, translating the desert's chaos into order. She paused, glanced through her scope, then wrote again. Around her, soldiers exchanged doubtful looks. "No one's ever hitting that," one muttered. "Hell, at that range, the bullet's practically curving with the earth," another whispered. Thompson caught the words, but said nothing. His binoculars were fixed on Sarah. Every move she made was deliberate, exact. She wasn't just calculating. She was conversing with the elements. The way she checked the breeze, the way her eyes tracked, the shimmering mirage that danced along the horizon. It was as if she were speaking the desert's language. The Barrett loomed in her hands, its long barrel pointed at a distance most called impossible. Her breathing slowed. Her body settled. She became still, a living extension of the weapon. Minutes passed. The air seemed to hold its breath with her. Finally, Sarah slid her pen behind her ear, closed the notebook, and laid her cheek against the stock. Through the scope, the steel plate at 3,200 meters swam in the heat haze, almost invisible. She adjusted her elevation knob. Click, click. Clicked the sound sharp in the silence. Then she adjusted for windage, her fingers steady as stone. Every movement was ritual. Every adjustment was faith. She inhaled. The Barrett roared. The recoil kicked like a mule, shaking the sand. A vapor trail spiraled through the air, vanishing against the distance. For a long, unbearable moment, there was nothing. The bullet was still traveling, carving through 2 miles of shifting air. 5 seconds. 6, 7, then clang. The steel plate at 3,200 meters shivered. A tiny spark flashed. A spotter froze, his mouth open. Then his voice cracked through the silence. Target hit. The line erupted not with laughter this time, but with gasps, curses, disbelief. No way. Holy, she did it. She actually, some shouted. Others stood in stunned silence. A few rubbed their eyes as if they'd imagined it. But the truth was undeniable. Sarah Mitchell had done the impossible. General Thompson's binoculars lowered slowly, his hands trembling despite decades of composure. He had seen men perform under fire, seen acts of bravery and skill beyond measure. But this was different. This was not just skill. It was mastery. He wanted to dismiss it as luck, as chance. But luck didn't calculate wind drift at 3,200 meters. Luck didn't keep hands steady as stone when every law of probability was against you. Luck didn't put steel into song after nearly 2 miles of chaos. This wasn't luck. This was destiny meeting preparation, and it shook him. On the line, Sarah exhaled, her body still calm, as if she had expected nothing less. She adjusted again, ignoring the murmurs, the stares, the awe. Her eyes stayed pressed to the scope, her breath slow and steady. She fired again. The Barrett thundered. Seconds stretched, the desert holding its breath. Clang. Another hit. Now the whispers turned into something else. Fear. Reverence. Soldiers who had scoffed now looked at her, as if she were something unnatural, a phantom given form. She had turned the impossible into routine. Shot after shot, the steel rang. Not every round landed, some flew wide, some vanished into the desert, but enough did, more than enough. Enough to prove it was no fluke, no accident. Enough to etch her name into every mind on that line. General Thompson lowered his binoculars completely. His face was unreadable, but inside something shifted. For years, he had lived by certainty. Who could be relied upon? Who could be dismissed? Who would rise? Who would fail? Sarah Mitchell had shattered that certainty with every shot. He had thought she was just polishing a rifle. Now, as the sun sank and the desert echoed with the memory of her impossible marks, he realized she had been polishing herself into a weapon no one had seen coming. The test ended not with applause, not with cheers, but with silence. Soldiers packed there, rifles quietly, their bravado gone, their eyes darting to Sarah with caution. Some were envious, some were afraid. All were changed. Sarah stood, lifted the Barrett with practiced ease, and slung it over her shoulder. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. The steel plates, still shivering from her last hits, spoke loudly enough. She walked past the line, her boots crunching in the sand, her face calm, almost serene. The murmurs followed her like shadows, but she paid them no mind. Behind her, General Thompson watched. His mind churned with questions, with possibilities, with a dawning respect he had not expected. The impossible mark had been made. And in that moment, Sarah Mitchell stopped being just another soldier. She became a legend in the making. The desert night had a way of swallowing sound, but even in that silence, General James Thompson could still hear it. The ringing of steel struck from an impossible distance. Hours had passed since the demonstration, yet the echoes lived in him like ghosts. He sat alone in his quarters, the hum of a desk lamp throwing sharp shadows across scattered reports. The pages before him listed equipment requisitions, training schedules, and names of men and women under his command. But the only name his mind repeated was Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell. He leaned back in his chair, his hand absently tightening around a half-empty glass of whiskey. He'd spent 35 years in uniform. He had fought wars, buried friends, led soldiers through victories and defeats. He had seen men break under pressure, and he had seen a few rise above the limits of flesh and fear. But never had he seen anything like this. He closed his eyes and remembered the moment in perfect detail. Sarah prone in the sand, calm as stone, the Barrett pressed to her shoulder. Not nervous, not seeking attention, just there, as if the rifle had always belonged in her hands. Her shot had flown across nearly 2 miles of shifting wind and mirage, and struck with the certainty of a hammer. It should not have been possible. Even the Army's most elite snipers had rarely touched that distance. Some claimed lucky shots. Some fabricated stories. But she had turned it into a demonstration, and it unsettled him. Because if one soldier could do that, what did it mean for all the rules, all the assumptions, all the careful lines he had built his career upon? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Enter," he barked, his voice sharper than he intended. The door opened, and there she was. Sarah Mitchell stood in the threshold, crisp in her fatigues, the Barrett not in sight, but its shadow still clinging to her. She saluted, formal and precise. "Sir, you wanted to see me?" Thompson studied her for a long moment before nodding. "At ease, Captain. Close the door." She did, stepping inside with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Thompson gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." They sat in silence at first. Thompson sipped his whiskey, while Sarah's eyes remained steady, unflinching. Finally, he spoke. "Do you know what you've done today?" "Yes, sir," she answered evenly. "No," he shook his head. "I don't think you do. You didn't just hit a target. You didn't just impress a few soldiers. You cracked something open. Something bigger." Sarah tilted her head slightly, waiting. Thompson leaned forward, setting the glass down with a sharp clink. "I've been in this army longer than you've been alive. I've seen men rise and fall. I've seen heroes built out of good shots, good speeches, or lucky timing. But what you did out there, that wasn't just skill. That was rewriting the damn rule book." Sarah's gaze never wavered. "With respect, sir, it was mathematics, training, patience, nothing more." "Don't insult me," Thompson snapped, then caught himself softening his tone. "Any trained sniper can make calculations. But you, Mitchell, you embodied them. You made them sing. And now I have to ask myself, where does that kind of precision come from?" Sarah looked down briefly, as if choosing her words carefully. "My father used to say the difference between ordinary and extraordinary is practice when no one's watching. I wasn't the strongest growing up, wasn't the fastest, but I could be patient. I could sit in the fields for hours, watching wind push the grass, counting how long it took birds to cross a distance. That patience, it stayed with me." Her voice was calm, almost detached, as if she weren't describing herself, but some other figure she had observed. Thompson studied her. He had expected arrogance, or false humility, or at least hunger for recognition. Instead, he found a strange, unnerving neutrality. She hadn't fired those shots for applause. She hadn't done it to prove him wrong. She had done it because it seemed she simply could. That kind of soldier was both priceless and dangerous. "Do you understand what this means for the Army?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She hesitated. "It means we can extend our effective range. It means tactics can change. Units can adapt." He shook his head. "It means more than that. It means men twice your age, with half your patience, are going to resent you. It means brass in Washington will either want to parade you as a miracle or bury your results so no one else feels inadequate. It means the enemy, if they ever learn your name, will see you as a ghost on the battlefield. And ghosts, Captain, are hunted." For the first time, something flickered across her face. Not fear, but something close to weariness. "I didn't do it to be a ghost," she said softly. "Then why?" Thompson pressed. She met his gaze again, steady and firm. "Because someone had to prove it could be done." The words hung between them. Thompson leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose. He saw now the core of who she was. Not a showman, not an ego-driven marksman chasing glory. She was a quiet storm, driven by an inner compass, unshaken by approval or disapproval. And that terrified him more than arrogance ever could. Because soldiers like Sarah couldn't be controlled. They could be guided, respected, even feared, but never owned. The rest of the night stretched on with questions and half-answers. He asked about her methods, her routines, her long nights of study. She explained with clarity, never embellishing, never exaggerating. When he asked what she wanted from her career, she simply said, to serve. But Thompson knew it was bigger. He could feel it, though she would never admit it. When she finally left, the desert wind slipping in as the door closed behind her, Thompson remained at his desk, staring at the reports he could no longer focus on. Sarah Mitchell was more than a soldier. She was a signal. A shift, and the army was not ready. As he poured the last of the whiskey into his glass, Thompson whispered to the empty room, "I thought you were just polishing a rifle. But you've been polishing the world into something new." The realization settled in his chest like a stone. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just the future of marksmanship, she was the future of warfare. And it was his job, whether he liked it or not, to prepare the army for a future written in the echo of impossible shots. The desert had long since fallen silent, but the echo of Sarah Mitchell's shot refused to die. Days later, Fort Bragg still hummed with the aftershock. The soldiers who had watched the impossible unfold replayed the moment over and over, their voices hushed but eager, as if afraid speaking too loudly would shatter the memory. In the chow hall, they leaned across tables, gesturing toward imagined horizons. In the barracks, whispers stretched into the night. Did you see it? Did you hear the plate sing? 2 miles, clean as a razor. Story spread the way wildfire, as when no one dares to contain it. By the 3rd day, the tale had reached soldiers who hadn't even been present. Each retelling grew sharper, more polished, like a stone passed from hand to hand. Some called it luck. Some called it destiny. But all agreed on one point. No one had ever seen a shot like that before. General Thompson felt it too. He had hoped briefly that the moment might fade into memory, that paperwork and routine would swallow it as the army always swallowed anomalies. But Sarah's name lingered, scrawled in margins, murmured in hallways, carried by officers who found themselves reevaluating what they thought possible. A ripple had become a tide. The official report was dry, clinical. Captain Sarah Mitchell successfully engaged a 3,200-meter target with Barrett M82. Variables accounted for: wind drift, heat mirage, elevation. Result: confirmed impact. But no report could capture what he had seen, the way the men had fallen silent, the way the desert itself seemed to pause, as if reality had bent around that single bullet. And reality was still bending. 2 weeks later, Washington called. Thompson sat in a conference room surrounded by men in suits, their pens scratching against paper as he delivered his account. They questioned, doubted, demanded exact coordinates, atmospheric data, the grain of the round. They wanted numbers, truth, certainty. But beneath their questions, Thompson sensed something else: unease. Because if Sarah Mitchell had truly done what he said she had, then doctrine had to change. Entire strategies had to be rewritten. The battlefield itself had shifted, because suddenly an American soldier could strike with surgical precision, at distances thought impossible, and the world would not ignore that. Back at the base, Sarah continued as if nothing had changed. She drilled quietly, maintained her weapons, and took her meals without fanfare. When soldiers approached her with wide eyes and questions, she deflected with humility, answering only what was necessary. She never bragged, never embellished. To her, the shot was not a crown to be worn. It was simply proof of what patience and practice could achieve. Yet the legend grew around her. whether she wanted it or not. Recruits began mimicking her habits, sitting longer at the range, watching the wind with new respect. Veterans spoke of her in grudging tones, half admiration, half bitterness, as though her success threatened to eclipse their own years of service. Some commanders saw her as a symbol to rally around. Others saw her as a disruption, a reminder that their rules no longer held absolute sway. And through it all, Sarah remained steady. One night, as the moon cast pale light across the motor pool, Sarah sat alone on the hood of a Humvee, the Barrett laid beside her. The air smelled faintly of oil and desert dust. Thompson approached, his boots crunching softly. For a moment, he simply watched her, the rifle gleaming like a shard of night. "Do you know what they're calling you now?" he asked finally. Sarah glanced up, expression unreadable. "No, sir." "The ghost of Bragg." His mouth twisted in something between amusement and concern. "They say you can reach out from 2 miles away and touch anything you want. They say no enemy is safe. They say." He trailed off, shaking his head. "They say a lot of things." Sarah gave a small, almost weary smile. "Stories have a way of growing bigger than the truth." "Sometimes," Thompson said, lowering himself to sit beside her, "but sometimes the truth is big enough on its own." For a while, they sat in silence, staring out into the desert. Thompson thought about all the legends he'd seen rise and fall. Most burned bright and fast men who wanted glory, who craved their names carved into the Army's history. But Sarah was different. She carried her legend like a weight, not a trophy. And that, he realized, was why it would last. Months passed. The Army never formally celebrated Sarah's feat. It was too destabilizing, too radical, but the story could not be contained. NATO allies whispered about it in joint meetings. Foreign analysts dissected it, trying to calculate if the shot was real or propaganda. Rival nations bristled, wondering if somewhere a woman with steady hands could erase their generals from miles away. Sarah's name became a shadow in intelligence reports, a question mark in war games, a ghost threaded into the language of strategy. And still, she refused to step into the spotlight. She trained, she served. She taught younger soldiers the art of patience. When they pressed her for the secret, she told them only, "Respect the wind, respect the time, respect yourself." Those words spread too, simple, unshakable, a mantra that outlived her presence. Years later, Thompson would retire, carrying the memory of that day like a scar and a blessing. But Sarah would continue, her legacy no longer tied to one rifle or one shot, but to the quiet revolution she had sparked. For in every barracks where young soldiers whispered, in every range where recruits stretched their limits, in every strategy room where commanders asked, "What if our reach is longer than we thought?" her presence lived on. Not in medals, not in parades, but in the changed minds of those who believed. And so the legend of Sarah Mitchell was written, not in ink, not in marble, but in steel. In the echo of a bullet that crossed 2 miles of desert air. In the silence that followed. She had not sought glory. She had not craved recognition. Yet she had become something more than either. A reminder, a challenge, a symbol, the kind of legacy that does not fade, because it is not carried by one person alone, but by all who hear the story and refuse to forget. The first thing Sarah Mitchell noticed about Fort Bragg wasn't the towering gates or the endless rows of barracks. It was the sound, the deep, unrelenting hum of a place that never slept. The roar of trucks on the tarmac, the distant crack of rifle fire from the range, the bark of orders cutting through the air like whiplash. It was a city of war, alive and restless, and she was stepping into its bloodstream for the first time. Her boots struck the pavement with deliberate rhythm, the weight of her rucksack pressing against her shoulders. To an outsider, she looked like any other soldier arriving at base, another face in the tide of uniforms, another body to fill the machine. But Sarah knew the eyes on her told a different story. A woman in combat fatigue still drew double takes, though she'd long since stopped noticing. What struck her more was the skepticism, the sideways glances, the almost imperceptible smirks of men who had already decided what she was worth before she'd even spoken. It was not hostility, not outright, just assumption. The kind that cut deeper than open disdain. They thought they knew her. They thought they'd already measured her. Sarah kept her gaze forward, jaw tight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The barracks smelled of polish and dust, a mixture that never quite left military housing, no matter how much bleach or elbow grease was applied. She unpacked in silence, her movements precise, folding her uniforms with sharp corners, aligning her gear in perfect symmetry. To anyone watching, it would have looked obsessive. To Sarah, it was ritual. Order in small things meant clarity in the larger battles. That evening, she walked to the range. The setting sun burned the sky in streaks of orange and crimson, throwing long shadows across the desert-like training ground. Soldiers were already there, firing in groups, their laughter rising above the crack of rifles. Sarah carried something heavier. The Barrett M82, a rifle, so massive that many joked it was less a firearm and more a cannon disguised with a stock rested across her shoulder. Heads turned as she passed, some with amusement, some with faint curiosity. The Barrett was not a casual weapon. It was the kind of rifle that broke collarbones if mishandled, the kind of rifle that demanded respect. And here she was, barely 5'7", slender compared to the broad-chested men who usually hauled the beast, carrying it as if it were no more than an extension of herself. "Hey," one of the soldiers called out, grinning as his buddies chuckled. "Need help polishing that thing, ma'am? Might be safer if you stick to an M4. Laughter rippled through the group. Sarah didn't flinch. She just set the Barrett down on the shooting bench with careful precision, running her hand across the cool steel. To them, it looked like she was just cleaning. A rookie playing with a toy too large for her hands. But Sarah wasn't polishing. For the sake of appearances, she was memorizing, feeling the weight, the balance, the slight imperfections in the metal. Every mark told a story, and she wanted to know the rifle better than anyone else before she ever pulled the trigger. The next morning, her official introduction to the base was brief and forgettable. General Thompson barely looked at her file as he handed it back across the desk. "Captain Mitchell," he said flatly, "welcome to Bragg. We'll put you where you fit best." His tone carried no malice, only indifference. She was a name in a stack, a cog to slot into the wheel. Sarah nodded, offered a crisp salute, and left without another word. But Thompson remembered her. Not for her file, not for her rank, for the Barrett. He had seen her carrying it across the yard the evening before, cradling it with the kind of care most soldiers reserve for family photographs. At the time, he had dismissed it as curiosity, maybe even bravado. Women had passed through his command before, some eager to prove themselves, some breaking under the weight of expectation. This one, he thought, would be no different. Still, the image lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Days bled into weeks. Sarah's presence became background noise to most of the base. She attended briefings, ran drills, marched with her unit. To outward eyes, she was simply another soldier blending into the machine. But at night, when the range emptied and the desert air cooled, she returned to the Barrett. She sat alone under the floodlights, the rifle spread before her like a puzzle, piece by piece. She studied every component, memorized the texture of the trigger pull, tested the balance of the bipod against the earth. She logged wind patterns in a notebook, tracked humidity levels, measured mirages rising from the sand. Where others saw a weapon, she saw a conversation between steel, air, and flesh. And she was determined to learn the language. The whispers began quietly. She's always out there at night. What's she doing with that thing? Maybe she's just trying to look tough. Most shrugged it off. A woman cleaning. A rifle was not news. But a woman spending hours with the Barrett, alone, night after night soon, it became something more. Curiosity, confusion, skepticism, and in a few, unease. General Thompson passed the range one night on his way back from a late briefing. The floodlights caught his attention, and there she was, Captain Sarah Mitchell, seated cross-legged in the dirt, Merritt across her lap, staring downrange at targets she couldn't possibly see in the dark. For a moment, he almost stopped to question her, but something in her expression made him pause. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't arrogance. It was focus. The kind of focus he had seen only in the rarest of soldiers, the ones who burned. With a fire so steady, so controlled, that you couldn't tell if they were on the brink of greatness or collapse. He walked on without a word, but that image stayed with him. Sarah didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know whispers had already begun to orbit her name. She only knew the silence, the cool desert air, and the rifle in her hands. She wasn't polishing. She wasn't pretending. She was preparing for something she couldn't yet name, for something that would one day etch her name into the marrow of the Army itself. And when that day came, everyone, General Thompson, the laughing soldiers, the doubters and the believers alike, would understand that the arrival of Captain Sarah Mitchell had been more than just another transfer. It had been the quiet beginning of a legend.